Today we're concerning ourselves with the figure of Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian officer who lived through the late 18th and early 19th century and who occupies a unique legacy in the history of war. He's arguably the preeminent philosopher of war, setting the study, the understanding of war on a new footing and with an influence that still echoes to the present day. So Clausewitz is a natural place in some ways to start, because much that Clausewitz has to say about war resonates still today, and where perhaps it resonates less, Clausewitz sets a particular model for a kind of idea of war, and many subsequent thinkers have spoken of post-Clausewitz in war, or have used Clausewitz as a model, a shorthand for a particular form of war, which might perhaps no longer be applicable today. So it's important for us to start grounding our study of war in the important features of Clausewitz thinking. The first thing to say about Clausewitz, and in this first video we'll talk about his biography and the times in which he lived through, which are significant. One thing to say about Clausewitz is that his reputation was quite slow to grow. He was not necessarily a major figure in his own lifetime, and after his death, many of his contemporaries, other strategic military thinkers, outshone him. And it's only over the course of the 19th century that his reputation began to grow in his native Germany, and then in the 20th century where his stature as this preeminent thinker of war really solidified. In contrast, and one of the reasons for this, is that Clausewitz's writing on war was quite different from the approach that many of his contemporaries took. Clausewitz wasn't interested in offering a doctrine or a set of laws or rules as to how to fight war. He was interested in offering guidance and advice to would-be military commanders, but more importantly, he was keen to establish a general philosophy of war. A philosophy that does not treat war as merely a technical exercise, that would be the sole province of military professionals, but one that rather insists on the historical and political embedding of war. So Clausewitz, in some ways, because of this more abstract philosophical approach to war, produced a work that transcended the narrow historical context in which it was produced, whereas many of his contemporaries, particularly those who were focused on how to wage war in the most effective manner, obviously became quite soon quite outdated, because they were thinking about war fought as it was in the 19th century, and of course war has transformed consequently since in a very significant way. So what does Clausewitz say about this historical and political embedding of war? Well, Clausewitz explains to us that war cannot be, and I quote here, cannot be divorced from political life. And that whenever this thinking about war occurs, the many links that connect the two elements are destroyed, and we are left with something pointless and devoid of sense. So the crucial point here that Clausewitz is making is that war is through and through a political activity. We cannot treat war merely as a technical exercise, something that military men do. We have to understand war as a political activity and understand how a political context for war will inform the development of that war. Let me say a few things then about Clausewitz's life, because it's very important to understand the context in which Clausewitz lived and wrote. He lived through particularly the upheaval in Europe of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed. Wars in which his native state of Prussia, this is prior to the formation of Germany as an independent state in the late 19th century, his state of Prussia was one of the major participants in the Napoleonic Wars, and a country that experienced a very chastening set of defeats. Prussia had been through the 18th century considered to be the preeminent military power of the age, the model for other armies in Europe. And yet, in the late 18th century and in early 19th century, it was defeated repeatedly by revolutionary armies and then by Napoleon. So for Clausewitz, who was profoundly committed to the Prussian state and an opponent of the French and the revolutionary cause, for Clausewitz it was key to understand why Prussia had been so defeated, what had changed in the circumstances of war that could have led to that outcome. And so that would have made Clausewitz particularly attuned to the fact that in different historical periods you might have different practices of war, and one has to be attentive to these particular historical circumstances in order to better understand the forms that war takes. Clausewitz himself had extensive military experience. He was born in 1780 into a military family. His father was an officer with some claim to minor nobility, hence the name von Clausewitz. And at the tender age of 12, Clausewitz, in 1792, Clausewitz became a soldier and took part in the campaigns of 1793 and 94 against revolutionary France. He continued to fight in the wars until the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So committed was he to the cause of defeating the French that he served both in the Prussian and the Russian armies. When the Prussians were defeated and surrendered to Napoleon, Clausewitz moved to Russia in order to keep fighting. He had a reasonably distinguished career, rising to the rank of Major General. At the conclusion of the war, he then occupied a role in a military staff college. He was effectively a kind of teaching role. His ambitions to rise within the military hierarchy were stifled to a large extent. And so he turned most of his attention to consolidating his thoughts, the reflections he had made during his experience of war against Napoleon and beyond. This would accumulate into the work that we now know as On War. This is a work he began writing in 1818. By 1831, so 13 years later, he was to perish, killed in a cholera outbreak, and he left an incomplete manuscript. He'd been revising that book for over a decade, but hadn't reached its completion when he died. So it fell to his widow, Marie von Brühl, to edit the manuscript and to publish it posthumously in 1832. Now, one of the things about this to note is because the work was effectively incomplete, it had been written to a large extent, but Clausewitz was still revising it. Because of this, various parts of the book are dated from various periods and therefore reflect different stages in Clausewitz's thinking. And so we know that Clausewitz was working through a number of revisions, that he changed his thinking over this period, but of course didn't have the time to complete the work. So to some extent there are tensions within the work because there are inconsistencies and perhaps even contradictions that are a reflection of this incomplete process of revision. As I said already, originally Clausewitz was eclipsed by contemporaries, people like Antoine de Jomini or Heinrich von Bülow, were more prestigious figures, and it was only belatedly that Clausewitz's star rose. Now, one of the things that most important things that Clausewitz has to say to us in On War, and really On War is the main work through which we know Clausewitz. There are some peripheral writings, but it is the main text, the one that's still read today in the essence. What Clausewitz says to us in that book is that war has a constant nature but a changing character. Or at least that's the way in which it's often summarized. Which is to say that Clausewitz tells us that war is conditioned by its historical and political circumstances. So in some ways war is never the same. It is always different. It is always influenced by a variety of external factors. But it does have a nature. It does have certain key consistent features. And so the whole exercise that Clausewitz would be committed to was to distinguish between what was essential to war, what was its inherent nature, and what was its character, what were the elements that would be variable and changing. Clausewitz writes that every age had its own kind of war, its own limiting conditions, and its own peculiar preconceptions. Each period, therefore, would have held to its own theory of war. One of the ways in which Clausewitz expressed this idea of a changing character of war is through the metaphor of war being a chameleon. War is like an animal whose external appearance, whose colors change and blend in with their environment. Or in other words, that the manifestations of war depend on the societies, on the characteristics of the societies that wage them. Furthermore, Clausewitz tells us, each individual war is unique according to the political motivations and situations which give rise to them. War is profoundly historically situated and contingent. Again, Clausewitz was probably made aware of this by the historical events that he traversed. What occurred in the context of the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars was what historians have sometimes referred to as a revolution in military affairs. The character of war changed at this period, but it did not change because of any major technological breakthrough. The ways in which armies were equipped in the late 18th century, early 19th century was not radically different from the way they had been equipped 50 years prior. What had fundamentally changed was the nature of French society. The revolution, in other words. What the revolution had allowed was to fight war on the basis of a kind of new nationalist revolutionary ideology. And what this meant was the ability to conscript an entire nation. The French practiced what became known as levée en masse, which is effectively mass conscription. And one of the major reasons for the successes of the French wasn't necessarily due to superior tactics, certainly not superior equipment, but the fact that they could simply put more men into the field, and that the men who were fighting those wars were more ideologically committed to the struggle than the professional armies that they were encountering. Napoleon used this to great effect. So by forcing the outcome of battles, by smashing the enemy, and even when he incurred dreadful defeats, by raising a new army soon after. So what Clausewitz would have understood, therefore, is that the changes in the social circumstances, in the nature of societies, can lead to very different ways of waging war. To such an extent that what had previously been the dominant form of war, that practiced by the Prussian military, could overnight become overwhelmed by this new mode of war.